everyone, and welcome to Marketing and Sales Over Cocktails, the weekly podcast that helps you grow your business, improve your life, and enjoy yourself along the way. I'm your host, Alan Langer, and every week we try to bring you the best thought leaders, the best business leaders, and the best minds out there to help you succeed in business and in life. So sit back, relax, grab your pad, your pen, and your favorite beverage, and enjoy the next episode of Marketing and Sales Over Cocktails. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Marketing and Sales Over Cocktails. This is your host, Alan Langer. We are flying along already in 2021, and I've got a really great, interesting guest tonight to talk about consumer behavior. It's a topic that we really haven't covered in the podcast so far. We obviously talk about sales and marketing and consumers with that regard, but this is about products and some really cool stuff. And my guest is going to be Michael Solomon, who's considered the premium expert in this category. But before we get to Michael, like we always talk about, a couple of quick housekeeping items. The website is marketingandsalespodcast.com. And the Ask Alan segment, if you want to send me a question, I get a bunch of great questions every week. Go to the contact section of that website, send me a question with your name and where you're from. And if I do read your question on the air, you get a free signed copy of my book. And we've got a good question coming from Peter from upstate New York later on that has to do with pricing and consumer stuff as well. So I am excited to talk to Mr. Michael Solomon. Michael, how are you tonight? Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on, and Happy New Year. Hopefully a better one.
Yes, hopefully we when this is coming out, you're going to have a new book coming out, which we're going to chat about a little later. But before we get there, we always start with a virtual cheers. So I kind of told you off air that I was having some computer difficulties and I was stressed. So this sip is going to be very good for me. So cheers, Michael. Thanks for being
on.
Salud, as my grandfather used to say.
Yeah, nothing like technology to drive you to drink. Right?
Oh, yeah, exactly. So, Michael, this is podcast number 38. And Michael, I think he found me or I found him. I'm not sure how, but as soon as I saw his background, I was like, I got to have him on the podcast because this is really great stuff because the people who are fans of my book or have read my book, I don't know if there's fans of it, but people who have read my book know I have a whole chapter about pricing, and pricing, I love to geek out on it because it's such a psychological thing. And Michael takes the whole thing about consumer behavior into that level, into that psychological realm. So he wrote a book called Consumer Behavior, Buying, Having, and Being, which is really considered one of the Bible of consumer behavior. And he has a mantra, which is really cool. He says, we don't buy products because of what they do. We buy them because of what they mean. So, Michael, give us a little background on how you got to where you are and your expertise and all of that good stuff.
Sure. And again, thanks for having me on. And, I have to warn you, never ask a college professor to tell you how he got to where he is, because he might tell you, and we don't have that long. But as you said, my focus, I'm actually, my doctorate is in psychology. And for many, many years, I've been focusing on the study of consumer behavior. So I've been a professor of marketing for many years. And I specialize in consumer behavior. I teach it at the undergraduate and graduate level. Currently, I'm at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. I've taught at a number of universities here and abroad. And basically, I got into this when believe it or not, back in the last century, when I did my PhD dissertation, I decided to do it on what was called then the dress for success phenomenon. Some of your listeners may remember that. And,
I think I remember that, actually.
That was all about the importance of appearance, to job success, et cetera. And that's actually, still a very, very important topic, even though we're all wearing sweatpants these days. But, I got into that because I realized that there was a lot of research, ton of research being done on the impact of appearance on your outcomes in life. whether you get a longer jail sentence if you're unattractive, things like that. I'll take my word for it. There's quite a bit, but almost all of it focused on the face and up. So it was only about facial, people who were lucky enough to be born looking like Tom Cruise or something like that.
Right.
And what I realized was, we all have bodies, and we put things on our bodies, and we put things around our bodies, and today we put things in our bodies. And nobody was really looking at the impact of possessions and our choice of what to wear, what to drive, how to decorate our homes, all those things, on the way we think about ourselves and the way we evaluate other people. So I did that. I did my dissertation on that topic. I found some pretty cool results there, started to work and develop an area of the psychology of fashion. But I quickly branched out because I realized that, it's a lot more than clothing that has this impact. So in the early days of my career, I started working with companies like, for example, Levi Strauss. I became a national media spokesman for Levi Strauss in my early days because I did research on, believe it or not, the psychology of blue jeans and people's attachments to their favorite pair of blue jeans, et cetera. And so over the years, I started to branch out. I started to look at automotive and cosmetics and footwear and home furnishings and even financial services. The point is that the way we define ourselves is so much a function of the things we choose to buy or the things we choose not to buy. And so, I like to say we are what we buy and we buy what we are. And it turns out that's interesting, not just to academics. It's pretty interesting to business people, to marketing people, because the primary motivation we have in most cases, the way that we choose one brand over others is because, as you said, it's not what it does, it's what it means. And over the years, it's just been a great ride because, if you think about it, in so many categories, consumer-facing categories, you could have 5 or even 10 brands that are fairly competitive. But in almost every case, there's going to be 1 or 2 brands that are really head and shoulders above the others. And you ask yourselves, why, whether it's Nike or whether it's Tesla or what have you. You can always pick out a few of the dominant players. And, what's funny is very often when you do research with consumers, and we can, talk more about that if you'd like, how we do that. And it makes managers crazy to hear this because you'll often put, let's say it's something like toothpaste, if you're marketing a brand of toothpaste, you live and breathe that toothpaste brand, you think it's wonderful. Mm-hmm. The problem is when you put it in front of consumers, you put 5 brands in front of them, you say, which is the best? You know what they often say? They're all pretty good.
Right.
They're all pretty good, which is the last thing you want to hear.
Right.
But again, there's going to be 1 or 2 maybe where they're not going to say that, where they're going to say, oh, that's, that brand really floats my boat. Mm-hmm. And so to me, the big challenge for business people is figuring out how to take their brand, let's assume that there's a minimum level of quality or performance, which it has to work. Mm-hmm. But once that's kind of that gets your ticket punched. But then how do you get to that level of what I call brand resonance, which means that a brand becomes part of really who you are for some reason. And there are a variety of ways to do that. But when you look at the winning brands, they're the ones that have figured that out. And it's usually because they are telling a story.
Right.
And my guess is when you do your sales training and all the things that you do, my guess is that word comes up.
It's a whole chapter in my book, and what you said there resonated quite a bit as far as they buy the products because what they mean. When I do sales training, I always say you never ever sell the product. You sell the feeling of what it is to own the product. You sell the problem that the product solves, and then what is the feeling of not having this problem anymore? oh, okay, now you know that feeling. This is how you're going to get there. Let me show you my product.
Exactly. And, and marketing is all about solving problems.
Right.
The thing is that many of those problems are not functional problems. They go beyond functional.
Right.
So, you can, if you have something like, I don't know, power tools, something like, my wife doesn't allow me to use power tools, but, something that's putting things together or whatever, sure, it's got to perform a function. But for so many of the things that are important to us, as I said, sure, we assume that it performs a function, but it goes so far beyond that, because by participating in that brand story, you're becoming part of that brand community. Mm-hmm. You're identifying with other people who use the same brand. And, I'm sure many of your listeners, have had this experience hundreds of times where you pull up to a stoplight and the person next to you is in the exact same car you're in.
Right.
And you're always interested to see, who is that,
And you normally give a thumbs up or something, or, go, hey, another
exactly,
Jeep driver.
But we like to connect, especially in modern, in the old days, the way people connected was in terms of where they were born, where they lived, because they lived the same place pretty much their whole life. Maybe their religion, that kind of thing. Today, a lot of the bonds that we form with people are not based on that, because they're no longer as relevant. Instead, they're based on the brands that we have in common.
Wow.
And so when people decide to join a brand, and sometimes it's called a tribe, maybe you've heard that term, tribal marketing.
Yeah. Yep.
If you're able to get into that tribe, and if the company is smart enough to encourage that, a great example comes to mind, Harley Davidson.
Right.
Again, my wife doesn't allow me to do that either, but she's really a very nice person. But, what Harley does is they recognize that people who drive Harleys feel a sense of kinship with other people who drive Harleys. So the way they promote and leverage the equity of that brand is, for example, they might sponsor, every summer in South Dakota, they have this massive bike rally. This past summer wasn't so great because it was a super spreader, but thousands and thousands of these bike riders are going to come from around the world, and they're going to bond with one another. They're going to buy the merchandise, and at the end of that week, their allegiance to that brand is even stronger than it was, because now they have bonded with other people who have the same preference. And so when you look at the success of many of these brands, and from a sales perspective, as I'm sure it's, you can be a great salesman, and I'm sure you can sell ice to Eskimos, right? But at the end of the day, it's all about, if I buy this brand, what does it say about me? And what does it say about me as someone who uses this brand as opposed to others? So we know, for example, that word of mouth, and, if you, we know that advertising really doesn't sell brands. Advertising plays other roles. But what sells brands is word of mouth and personal referrals or recommendations. Mm-hmm. And so it's a matter of reaching out, not just to the company that creates the brand, but even more so to the community of people who use that brand.
Well, this is
it's word of mouth that is the sales tool. Advertising or other collateral, those are just props that help you in that process.
This is also fascinating because when you're talking about the brands like Harley Davidson, and for me, Apple comes to mind immediately, because talk about a tribe. And this just happened to me the other day. So I started a text conversation with someone who I had literally just met. And when I sent her a text, she sent back, "Oh, you're green. I have an Android phone." And so my texts come through as green, not as blue, because on the Apple iPhone, they come through as blue for my message. And immediately I was ostracized because I was not an Apple iPhone user right off the bat. And I was like, I was actually fascinated, like, wow, you're judging me because of the phone that I'm using.
You didn't drink the Kool-Aid. And you know what? There's research that shows that children as young as 3 or 4 years old make those distinctions. They actually have learned to judge people, judge other kids based on the brands they use, and it only gets worse from there.
Yeah.
And part of that is, if you want to talk about the psychology of it a little bit, basically the way our brains work is that we're really driven to put things into categories and assign them labels because we want to understand them. And the most basic label we use is good versus bad. Like, is this guy walking down the street toward me going to be a friend, or is he going to mug me? That's a very basic kind of thing. And then there are other kinds of distinctions that we make. But as soon how do we put people into categories when we don't know them? As you say, I mean, if it's a friend that you've known for 20 years, you can go beyond that. But if it's someone that you've met for the first time, what our brains do is we use the cues that are available to us. Most of them are visual, but not all. Mm-hmm. And so we look at them and we say, okay, they've got a certain, facial appearance. They have certain racial identity, gender identity. They obviously have certain lifestyle preferences because they ride a Harley or they drive a Tesla, or mm-hmm. they wear Adidas or on and on and on, or they're vegan, etc. So every one of the lifestyle choices that we make essentially puts us into a category, whether or not that category is accurate. The problem is that we often, even though it may be inaccurate, we're often very reluctant to change our minds. And so, to put it into your world, in the sales context, we make judgments about a salesperson, and the salesperson makes a judgment about the customer. They decide, for example, is he or she a good prospect? Can they afford what I'm selling, et cetera? And once we put them into that category, it's very, very difficult to change that. So in sales, as in the rest of life, the expression, you never get a second chance to make a good first impression.
Right.
And that's a part of this. And that is actually correct, because once our brains have put us somewhere, we're kind of lazy in the sense that we don't want to revisit that assignment and say, no, actually he belongs in this category.
Right. So I want to dig a little deeper here, because what you're talking about is really got me thinking about, way beyond sales 101 and sales 102. It's like, when I get deep with some sales training, I start talking about, okay, now we need to start recognizing the personality that is in front of you. First of all, you got to know what personality you are and how you're going to relate to whoever's in front of you. How does that translate into consumer behavior? Like, I immediately think of, if I go to, like, let's say I go to Walmart, I'm looking for or even Best Buy, one of the big box stores, and I'm looking for a laptop, and there's literally 50 laptops. Mm-hmm. But I'm personality X and my girlfriend is personality Y. How does the company say, we're going to make this laptop? Do they say we wanted to appeal to most personalities, or do they pick some that how do they deal with that kind of consumer behavior?
Well, it's a great question. It's more complicated than it sounds.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure it is.
But to boil it down, I mean, well, all right, let me start. So I'll start with a story. Back in the day, you've heard of a guy named Henry Ford. And of course, what was his genius? His genius was efficiency and, maximizing production, standardization.
Assembly line, right.
Yeah, the assembly line. Now, and that was great at the time because nobody else could make a car, pretty much. He was one of the first. And he was famous for saying, my customers can have their Model T in any color they want, as long as it's black. That's true. Now, the problem, and so when you're the only, guy out there and you're only selling black cars, guess what? I'm going to buy a black car if I want to get from point A to point B. So that was great until competition starts to enter, specifically General Motors. And, their insight was not everybody wants a black car. And some people can actually afford a car that's got more bells and whistles, on it than another car. And so their insight, they actually invented the concept of market segmentation, of creating these large groups of people that share something in common. So what they did was they created divisions like Chevrolet and Cadillac. Some of them are no longer with us, like Oldsmobile, et cetera, but many of them still are. And so, that was a really, really important milestone in marketing, because it meant it was a recognition that there's, in many, many cases, there's no such thing as something as a mass market where everybody is identical.
Right.
And so over the years, we start to see that companies and brands are competing on the basis of differentiating their offering from other offerings. And what that means is it actually is kind of a painful recognition that I will not sell to 100% of people. I can't expect 100% of people to like my brand. But what I can do is I can find that, 40% of people that really like my brand because it harmonizes with who they are, or it meets their needs in a certain way. And so for the last 100 years, pretty much, give or take, it's been a race to figure out how can we get that definition of who that person is to be more and more specific. So in the so in the 1950s and 60s, I hope I'm not giving you a long history lesson that you don't want, but
no, it's fascinating to me because
in the 50s and 60s, we had something called broadcasting that came around, right? And what that meant was, some people are old enough to remember that we had only three television stations. And so if you wanted to reach almost all of the United States, on a Sunday night, you could pretty much count on the fact that they were watching Ed Sullivan. Right. And so if you buy your advertise, you're going to reach a pretty big swath of people. Now, fast forward to today, and other than maybe a Super Bowl or the Olympics, where are you going to find a large majority of people that are tuned in, at the same moment?
You're not.
Because in the first case, many of them are probably taping whatever it is and watching it at a different time. But now we have, what do we have? I don't know, 1,500 channels, and nothing on most of them. But each of them is very, very specific. And so as the technology improves, it becomes possible to get to the point where we no longer, even what General Motors did no longer works very well anymore. And actually the book that I've just written, it's coming out. The basic premise is that we can no longer rely on the tried and true techniques of market segmentation, because people are no longer content to be pigeonholed into these categories.
Right.
So when I say to my undergraduates, if I say to them, well, brand X basically looks at you or let's say the women in the class, and I say, well, you're all women in your 20s and you go to a private urban university. Therefore, you're all identical, aren't you? And they look at me like I'm crazy because they know that they're not identical. Right. And with the advent of technology, that internet thing, which looks like it's probably going to take off, we are literally able to fine tune our access to the brands that are out there, even if they're not sold at our corner store. So whether it's music or clothing or food or science or whatever it is, we're able to actually create at this point what we call a market of one. And so Alan can be my market segment. And anybody who does internet marketing and who is really good at SEO and all that stuff, and I'm sure you talk about a lot of that. Anytime you're fine-tuning your messages, let's say on Facebook ads or something, based on what a person has already chosen in the past, because that's how SEO works, right? And behavioral tracking and so on. You're literally creating a market of one, because you and I could be, fairly similar to one another in a lot of ways, and I suspect that we are. But your preferences may be slightly different than mine. Let's say we're talking about music. You might be into a certain kind of obscure music, and I'm into a different kind of, I don't know, the British invasion from the 60s. So even though we still overlap to a large extent, we're not identical. And the companies that figure out how to tailor a very personalized, specific message from a specific message from a sales point of view, that's where the prospect, that's where you don't have to sell anymore, right? I mean,
Exactly.
a famous Peter Drucker, famous management theorist, once wrote, "The aim of marketing is to make selling superfluous."
Yep.
Now, I don't know if you want to hear that or not, but the point is that if I create an offering that is so perfectly aligned to what you are looking for, I don't have to sell it to you.
Right.
You're just going to reach out and take it.
Right. Right. And you have to. You're right. You're 100% right, because that's where marketing and sales have to align, and everybody needs to be on the same page. So. And I absolutely love that quote, because you're right. If it's marketed properly, the only thing the sales guy or the sales girl has to do is not screw it up, basically.
Right. It would be an order taker, and make sure they get the right order. But now, fortunately, I guess for salespeople, that kind of 100%, resonance doesn't happen too often. Doesn't happen.
Yeah. But let's say I got a lot of small business owners in the audience, a lot of solopreneurs. So when talk about, and you're touching on it now, as far as really narrowing in your service or your offering. Talk about something that they could focus on, or like, let's say they have, I don't know, 3 products. Let's say they sell software. What would you say to them? Not the big company, but the small company, about their product offerings?
Well, what I would say to a company of any size, and I'm often surprised, when I work with the big companies over the years, how many of them don't do this. Don't assume that you know who your customer is. Mm-hmm. Because what I found, my experience is, we often have in our minds, and we always have somebody in mind, as we're kind of, maybe you're developing a sales presentation or something. What we often have is the customer that we want to have, rather than the customer that we actually have. So when you see, for example, so many brands are chasing a certain type, like let's say a woman in her late 20s or early 30s who makes a really good income, that could be your ideal customer, and everybody wants that customer. Nobody wants the woman who is 60 years old and lives by herself.
Right.
But the problem is that actually may be your customer. And there's lots of examples, for example, of retailers who tried to go beyond their base, JCPenney being one of those. Mm-hmm. And they're, on their last legs for that reason and for others. So the first thing I would say is this, is don't sit on your butt in your office and speculate about who your customer is and whether they would like what you're planning to sell them. Go out, and what I like to say is fish where the fish are, right? Go out into this community of people. Let's say you have already a fan base, a customer base. Go out and talk to those people. Don't just assume that you understand them. And there are certain industries that are really good at this and others that aren't. So for example, personal care products, a Procter & Gamble, they get it. They understand it. Some industries, like let's say furniture, the furniture industry is notoriously reluctant to rely on anything but their own insights. There are going to be exceptions.
Really?
And then we could talk about lots of other industries in between. But the point is that you need to get out and at least validate your assumptions by doing consumer research. And when you do that research, there are many ways to do it. We could devote another 20 hours to talking about that. But one thing that's often very helpful, that a lot of people are doing today, is they're creating what's called a persona. I don't know if you talk about that.
I don't personally, but it's funny that you're mentioning this, because I'm actually doing some individual coaching with a consumer researcher now. That's what she does. And she's starting her own firm, and I'm talking about that, helping her do that. But it's what you're talking about is stuff that she's mentioned to me that I didn't even know existed. So this is cool stuff. So yeah, please go on.
Yeah. Well, basically, and I'm going to tell you why it's not as good as it sounds in a minute. But what's good about it is what you do when you create a persona. Some people call it an avatar.
Yep.
What you're doing is you're identifying as specifically as possible your customer. So basically, you have a story. You might have and it's not a real person. It's kind of an amalgamation of many of your customers.
Right.
So let's say that you're Lululemon, right? Mm-hmm. Phenomenally successful. Now, when the guy who came up with that concept, Chip Wilson, he basically created a male persona and a female persona, which was the customer that he always wanted to have in mind as he started and his team started to develop their offerings. And so it might be, for example, and you can guess who that customer is. She might be, let's say, a woman, kind of like what I was just saying. She's in her 20s. She's prioritizes fitness. She spends X number of hours a week exercising, but she also does X, Y, and Z. She travels here, or at least pre-COVID. She mm-hmm. travels here and she does this on vacation, and she values this, and she politically she's that. She reads these magazines, she visits these websites, et cetera. And once you do that, you now go from saying, when you think about your customer and what do they need, it's not just some amorphous, woman or man, who likes to do yoga.
Right.
It's much more specific than that. And then when you give that to your team, or your team is developing this, you want to have that internal alignment. Because just like in sales, you want all your salespeople to be aligned in terms of what is the story they're telling about the company. Right? We call that internal marketing.
Right. It's
in some ways just as important as external marketing. So now everybody's aligned with that, and they're able to be a lot more creative, and they're able to be a lot more vivid, if you will, because they're going beyond simple demographics, like it's a woman in her 20s. Mm-hmm. And now they're actually painting a picture of who she really is. And they can identify what are her touch points. In other words, let's not even just describe what she looks like. Let's talk about what her day looks like. She goes from here to here to here. Now, why is that important? Because if you, as a salesperson, want to connect with her, you need to know where to find her, because she's no longer sitting at home. Right. She's either going to websites or, after we all get vaccinated, she's on Wednesday nights, she, goes to this karaoke bar or whatever it is. and so
and she's a terrible singer,
in media stuff, they just call this omni-channel marketing, which means be where your customer is at, not where you want to put your messages. Put your messages where your customers are going to be. So for example, as some companies began to figure this out, let's say they wanted to target college students or young people, the amount of money they allocated to out-of-home advertising grew exponentially. So you start to see, for example, in bars, you might start to see these closed circuit, networks that advertise in bars.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's somebody figured out, to their credit, that guess what? That's where, these people are spending a lot of time. So mm-hmm. if I just advertise to them, on their favorite TV show, I'm not going to catch them.
Yeah.
So the persona, it consists of a very detailed portrait of who the person is, how they spend their life, what their values are. Now, I made the comment that it's not as great as it sounds. And the reason is that there's a certain qualification here. And that is that one reason I talk about consumer chameleons is that the modern consumer changes his or her identity, just like a chameleon changes their colors. The modern consumer changes their identity rapidly, sometimes several times during the day. So we become different people as we are involved in different parts of our lives. You're not the same if you're out on a date. You're not the same person as you are with your buddies watching a football game. Mm-hmm. Right? Hopefully mm-hmm. you're not. You're using different products. You're thinking about different things, And so getting the mistake you can make is once you create the persona, not being willing to deviate from the persona, right? And just thinking that all of your customers look exactly like that woman or that man.
Right.
So you have to recognize that even that woman, that, let's say, Lululemon customer is not always thinking about yoga. She's got other things. She's got professional things, maybe kids things, maybe she is a wine connoisseur, whatever it is. So the caveat is, it's really important, I think, and helpful, especially for small business people, to have this much more vivid picture of who their customer is and what their lives are like. But don't get hemmed in by that, because that persona is going to change. She's not going to be the same woman a year from now that she is now, with COVID or without it. She's going to change. And so you can't be, the problem, that one thing I see a lot of business people do, both large and small, is that they do a little consumer research, and then they think they've ticked the box, and now they don't have to do it anymore. Yeah. And that is so untrue, because you get hemmed in by these outdated stereotypes, because each of us is a work in progress. Everybody who's listening or watching this podcast, including you and me, we're all a work in progress. We have certain things we're aspiring to. We're aging, and we're changing our priorities. We're getting exposed to new cultures, to new destinations, to new music. And so every day when we get up, we're literally not the same person we were when we went to bed.
That's fascinating. That really is. So if you're focusing on your client avatar, your persona, and you do your research and you say, okay, this is my client avatar, and then you do your marketing based on that avatar, but then that avatar, you're saying, is going to change at some point. How do you know when to change? How do you know when to refocus your marketing?
Well, ideally, you're in the field all the time collecting feedback from these people.
So it's constant research then.
Well, and here, and here's where we get, I was making this point before about the importance of the community to salespeople. You're probably, I don't know if you're familiar with the 80-20 rule. Do you talk about that?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yep. Okay.
Yep.
So, that has different, plays out differently in different fields. But in marketing, we say that, as a guideline, rough guideline, 80% of your sales come from 20% of your customers.
Right.
Now, that's not gospel, the 80-20, although it often does work out pretty close.
Yeah.
But what it says is that most marketers are a lot more focused on getting their next customer than they are on getting more value from their existing customer.
I think that's 100%.
And we know that it's far more expensive to acquire a new customer than it is to keep an old one. Yeah. But we tend to, it's kind of like you make a good friend and you take them for granted, and you don't bother checking in with them anymore because, they're your buddy. They'll understand. Mm-hmm. That 20% or whatever that number is, that when you want to talk about salespeople, they are the best salespeople that you have, because they become your brand evangelists. Mm-hmm. And so they are the best resource for getting feedback, not just about your marketing, by the way, but about your products themselves. So ironically, in industrial marketing, like chemicals and things like that, they figured this out years ago. They take something like the chemicals industry, not the sexiest industry, but in that industry, research has shown that something like 70 to 80% of ideas for new chemical products came from the company's customers.
Not from that high, really.
Not from their own, engineers.
Wow.
So it varies by industry, but in virtually, and that's why, and so today when we talk about, influencer marketing and bloggers and things like that, these people can not only, number one, they can be a brand evangelist, because if they like your brand, they're going to push it. But they can also be an amazing source of feedback about how you should improve your brand. So I don't think of them as consumers. I think of them as co-creators. And the irony is that in many cases, and you mentioned Apple before, frankly, they're the prime offender, although I shouldn't tell them how to do their business. They seem to have figured it out. But, they're notorious for not letting anybody peek under the kimono, right? They won't release, it's a scandal if somebody, an employee of Apple leaves a design for the new iPhone in a bar, right? That's happened a couple of times by accident. They won't release anything until it's ready to go. And for the most part, that is the exact opposite of the way business works today. Because in today's world, everything is always in beta.
Yeah.
And it's the software developers who figured this out, right? Because if you code software, you want to get it debugged by the people who are going to use your program.
Yep.
So if you don't get their input and then you release it to the market and there's thousands of bugs in it, you're doomed, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So they're never reluctant to share, for the most part, to share their code. Now, consumer products companies were kind of late to the game on that. But the ones that have adopted that perspective have been extremely successful. I'll give you an example. Legos, the kids' toys, amazingly successful. They were on the, for a while, about, 20, 30 years ago, they were on the verge of bankruptcy.
Yeah, I remember that.
But what they did was they realized that they had this incredibly enthusiastic community of people out there, kids and adults, I guess, who love to make these Legos. And somebody, in that company had the insight, why don't we ask them what should be our newest Lego product? Wow. So today they have a Lego community of, I think, something like 10,000 people who are their customers, who regularly contribute ideas. Here's what I want to see next.
Yeah.
And if they make it, they'll reward them for that, because that's incredibly valuable marketing intelligence, right?
Well, what's really neat is you just this was just this past weekend. I have a 12-year-old daughter, and I'm in Rhode Island, and Hasbro is located. Main headquarters of Hasbro is in Providence,
right.
And I found out just by accident from a mother I was speaking to that Hasbro has a program for Rhode Island kids to come in and play with their toys, and they get all this feedback from the kids, and that's
exactly.
And she's like, you got to sign up for it, because you play with the toy and you go home with it. If it's even if it's got bugs in it, you still keep the toy for free. But they have all the information from the kids.
Ironically, the kids' toy industry, they're pretty advanced. Companies like Mattel, I mean, they all have these sophisticated labs where they're going to have kids play with their Barbies or whatnot and watch them very carefully. And they've been doing this for many years. So this is no surprise to them. But I can tell you that many, many companies don't do this on a systematic level. But the ones that do really benefit because again, one of the biggest mistakes I see, and again, small business, big business, you're not leveraging your 20, you're more focused on your 80%.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the biggest asset you have from a sales perspective, getting these people to sell for you. The direct selling industries, I guess, figured this out, and very successful, the Amways and Tupperwares of the world.
Mm-hmm.
But many others haven't.
Yeah. This is great stuff, Michael. It really is. So I want to segue into your book before we run out of time here. And then we'll get to the Ask Alan question. But tell me about your new book, which is called The New Chameleons. We mentioned Chameleons before, you did. Connecting with Consumers Who Defy Categorization. So what does that mean, and what's your book about? And I think it's coming out pretty right around the time this podcast is coming out. So hopefully people can pick it up.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Basically what I've done in the book is I've identified a bunch of very fundamental assumptions we make about customers. Very fundamental. And we talked at the beginning about labels. That what we tend to do is we like to put our customers into these convenient categories. And I'll give you an example or two. And then we act as if they have no identity other than being in that category. So what I've done is to identify a series of these fundamental assumptions, and then I've shown why they no longer are true.
Oh, okay.
So to give you some examples of those, online versus offline. Back in the 80s and 90s, should we have an online strategy? Well, today we know that, especially, from I see, with my undergrads, there's no distinction. They don't make the distinction between, they don't say I'm going online or I'm going offline. You and I might, you probably spend a lot of your life online, but I'm betting you at some level in your head, you're aware that you're either going back to the physical world or you're going online. These kids are not doing that. They're constantly, and I can tell you because they're sitting in my class looking at their phones.
Right.
They're constantly, so if you base your strategy on that distinction, you no longer have that omni-channel approach that we were talking about. So that's an example. Another one would be male versus female, right? Most consumer marketing is built around the idea that either men or women are buying a product. Today, if you look at the kinds of conversations we're having, not just in the US, but around the world, that distinction is no longer really relevant. We have a focus on the gay community, but also, many people who will not specify a gender. We have certain states where you're no longer required to specify a gender on your driver's license. Facebook gives you close to 60 options in terms of identifying yourself around gender.
Sure.
Now that's very controversial, but it's incredibly important if you're in an industry, let's say the fashion industry. If you look at what a lot of the big fashion houses are doing, COVID aside, and all the adjustments they're making, many of the big houses are no longer having fashion shows for their men's lines and their women's lines. The products are being melded together. Right. So again, changing your mindset and looking between the lines there is something that's very important. So no matter your listeners are all into some industry that has certain categories it uses. For example, in the fashion industry, you might have, let's say, resort wear and casual wear and athletic wear and things like that. That entire industry is organized that way. Every industry is organized in some way. The real potential for success is if you can look beyond those, you identify what the categories are, you look beyond them and you look for hybrids. So, for example, we have, let's say in the automotive industry, what do they say? Well, they talk about coupes, they talk about convertibles, sedans, the minivan Chrysler invented the minivan, right? But now, what is the biggest selling category? It's the SUV. That's a category that didn't exist 20 years ago.
Right.
So the SUV is a hybrid of the sedan and the minivan.
Right.
Right. And in just about any industry, you can do this. And there are success stories, and I talk about some of them in the book, where you take the existing categories and you say, I don't want those categories because I'm going to come up with a new category.
Yeah.
Right. And so whether it's, demographic like black versus white, that's largely going away. Male versus female, as I already said. Buying versus leasing is another one. Humans versus robots is another one. In sales, that's a very, very important one. I don't know if you talk about that, but as automation is taking over in the sale, with call centers and chatbots and all that kind of stuff, people no longer are making the distinction as they used to between a human and a non-human who is a salesperson.
Yeah.
And I mean, I do an entire keynote presentation on this. It's fascinating to me. Saudi Arabia actually granted citizenship to a robot.
Really?
Yeah. And there are and when you look at the numbers of robots or androids or cyborgs, however you want to define it, when you look at the sales of those that are as they're going to companies, whether it's financial services in Japan, you have a bank that has a robot assistant. When you look in stores like Lowe's, they have robots in some of their stores that are going up and down in the aisles.
Yep, I've seen that. Yep.
The sales profession is going, people talk about how truck drivers are going to be displaced by self-driving trucks. I think the sales profession is going to be one of the most disrupted professions as AI, artificial intelligence, gets more and more sophisticated. We're going to see an amazing disruption in this category. Because
this is a whole other category to talk about right here. And I'm going to, after we wrap this up, I want to talk to you offline about this a little bit, but we're running out of time. So this is really a fascinating topic, Michael, but let's get to the Ask Alan question here. And I know this has a little bit to do with consumer behavior, but it also has to do with pricing. And I know, with your experience, I'm sure you can add some insight on this, but Peter from upstate New York writes in, what is the best way to price my products from a psychological standpoint? And I have a little bit of an answer to that, but how would you answer that for Peter?
Yeah. Well, pricing decisions are strategic decisions. It's part of the so-called marketing mix that we love to talk about, the 4 Ps. And what that means is that pricing is not just it's not just the economic value you assign to a product. It's part of your marketing strategy.
I agree. Right.
Which means you have to be willing sometimes to go lower or higher than you want to based on the economic value. So, there's lots of kind of tricks. We talk about psychological pricing. So, one of the most common ones, all of your viewers know this, is odds versus evens.
Okay.
You're far more likely to see a price in odd numbers.
Yep.
And usually the 99. So something that's $399 is considered to be a lot cheaper than one that's $400.
Correct. Yep.
Right.
It's fascinating.
And the reason, one reason for that, the way I would approach the answer is that, again, getting into this notion of categories, and keep in mind, our brains, we're always assigning things into categories. So referent pricing means that when you assign a price, you have to take into consideration your competitors, obviously, where you are in the market. And you have to recognize that the way your customers assign value to your product is going to determine the price they expect to see. So to give you an example, I don't know, let's talk about appliances. Why not? Refrigerators, right? So you have, I'm no expert on refrigerators, but you have different price points, let's say. So you go to JCPenney or where Best Buy, whatever it is, and there are some, let's say just make it simple. Let's say there's, kind of value priced ones, moderate, and then the super fancy ones. I'm sure there are more gradations, but let's just talk about those 3. Now, if consumers have decided, if consumers have decided for whatever reason that my refrigerator is a value price, it's a value-based, discounted, no bells and whistles refrigerator, then when they see the price, they're going to compare it not to all refrigerators, but to the ones in that category. There's that word again. Right? So the first thing you need to understand is where, not just that consumers see that you sell a refrigerator or whatever you sell, but what kind of, where is it in that market space that's there? And is there the potential to change that perception, right? So let's say that that first level, let's say that they sell for $300. I'm obviously making up the number, but the intermediate level, the typical price is $500, and then the higher level is $900. I know those aren't real prices,
right?
But if I want to sell my refrigerator for $500, I've got to make sure that when I ask people, I want you to name 3 brands of refrigerators that are in the moderate range. I want to make sure that my brand comes up there, because if it doesn't, I can't charge that $500. However, if for some reason, if I say to people, name me the 3 fancy brands that you would find in a celebrity's home or on, HGTV or something. And if they name my brand there, and I'm only selling my brand at $500, I'm leaving money on the table because I could be charging $900.
Right, right.
But the point is that I can't put the cart before the horse. I can't just assign a monetary value until I know what the psychological value of my product is relative to the other products in that space, and what are the other products people are comparing it to. So, there are many instances where brands make it difficult for people to compare. An example might be one of my favorites from a few years ago, frozen dog food. So it was a premier dog food, really good apparently, but it was in the frozen food section. Now, when people go to buy the dog food at the grocery store, they go to the section that's got all the dog food. So they're not going to be looking in the frozen food section.
Right, right.
And they're not going to be evaluating it the same way. So you can either walk away from money because you could be underselling. Depends obviously what kind of product it is. So, if it's a luxury product of some kind and your viewer didn't specify what kind of product it is, ironically, what we often find there is that as you raise the price, we're all familiar with the famous demand curve, as you raise the price, demand goes down. Right. Not always true.
Right, right.
If it's a luxury product, ironically, there have been many cases where, a piece of jewelry or whatever it is doesn't sell for $100. So they raise the price to $200 and then it sells. Right. And that's not going to work for a refrigerator.
Right, right.
So you need to understand what is, where are you doing business and how are people thinking about that? And how are they using price as a cue to tell them what that product is and where it's supposed to compete?
This is that is a wonderful answer because like I mentioned off the air with you beforehand, I have a whole category. I have a whole chapter in my book about pricing and how psychological it is, because most companies, with the exception of the retail industry, makes the mistake of basing pricing on an algorithm or a spreadsheet, or let's sit at Starbucks and figure out how much we should charge and what our profit margin is. Whereas if they actually say, okay, like you said, instead of charging $4.23 because that's going to give us the proper margin, you make it $4.97, and that's going to feel psychologically better to the customer. One of the things I would add for Peter, besides what you said, which was brilliant, is, and you actually brought it up, is like, you should always, if you can, present your product or your service in choices of 3, because the brain loves the choice of 3.
Exactly.
And for me, I train where if you really want the customer to purchase the best. Let's say you're selling a service, and this service, that let's say you have bronze, silver and gold. That gold is the best bang for the buck and it's the best service to buy. But obviously it's the most expensive. And most companies make the mistake of saying, I just want them to buy the silver. I want them to buy the middle one. Where I'm like, you want them to buy the gold one because that's the one they're going to be the most happy with. So price your products. Let's say it's the famous example is the movie theater popcorn, where the manager had a small for $3 and a large for $8. And they never sold any larges. They only sold a $3 popcorn. I'm sorry, it was $7. So he said, well, let's make a medium. And the assistant manager said, well, okay, we'll make the medium $5, $3, $5, and $7. He's like, no, let's make it $6.50. So now you make it $6.50. The $7 popcorn looks like, whoa, what a great deal. It's only 50 cents more and I get a large. So that's how I talk about pricing. If you can put it in 3 and guide the customer psychologically toward the better deal, they're going to feel better about buying it, and they're going to think that they got a good price.
Absolutely. And the power of 3. I mean, there's a reason that the example I gave was I use 3 categories. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. So, Well, Michael, we have to go. This has been a fascinating conversation. And I just want to remind people to get your book, The New Chameleons, Connecting with Consumers Who Defy Categorization. I think it's going to be fascinating. I can't wait to pick it up when it comes out. If people want to contact you or say hello or look you up, where can they find your information?
Sure. Well, they can go to my website, which is simple. It's michaelsolomon.com.
Okay.
And, if they go there, there's a way to email me. My phone number's there, et cetera.
Okay, great. And are you on LinkedIn as well? Because a lot of my listeners
absolutely.
Yep, okay, LinkedIn. Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Michael, thank you for your time. This has been great. I'm actually going to stay on after we're done because I want to chat with you about something else. But thank you, everyone else, for being here. Thank you, Peter, for your question. It was a fascinating question. We got some great answers from Michael. This has been Marketing and Sales Over Cocktails with Alan Langer. Remember the Ask Alan segment. Send me your question. And if I read it on the air, you're going to get a free signed copy of my book. Peter is getting one. It's going to be mailed out tomorrow morning. And we will, again, do that every week. So thanks for joining episode number 38. And we will see everyone next time.